I'm here with Jamie Schorr, the Chief Cooperative Procurement Officer with the National Association of State Procurement Officials. Jamie, thanks so much for taking the time to join us here at the inaugural StateRAMP event.
Thank you, Jason. Great to be here.
You are not a cyber person. You're not in the world of cybersecurity per se. I mean, everybody is these days. You're a procurement official, and I think that's where we're going to start. Why are you here if this is not a procurement conference? And I mean that in the most serious way. No.
Of course.
Of course.
Joe and JR asked me several years ago, hey, what do you think about this idea of StateRAMP and implementing some standardization within the procurement world as it relates to selecting vendors and suppliers on a standardized basis such that we can identify the minimum standards for cybersecurity, NIST standards, etc. And as a procurement professional, half of what they said, I really didn't understand. Fast forward now to 2024, I find it incredibly fascinating that everybody's job is cybersecurity, including procurement professionals. So I'm one of the founding members of StateRAMP on the steering committee, really passionate about understanding cybersecurity and how procurement professionals can better help protect their states or their public entities from cybersecurity threats.
Do you know all the acronyms now? Are you fully engaged? Zero Trust is like each evening you think about Zero Trust in a way that relates to procurement. Do you know all your seams and SOARs? Do you have it all down?
I created my own cheat sheet, admittedly, but please don't publish that.
Yeah. I think if you could sell it, people would buy it.
Absolutely.
They understand all the things.
My $1 million check is coming.
Exactly, for the cheat sheet. But I think this is a really important point that you brought up, is that being included in this idea of StateRAMP, it's not just about cybersecurity, because how it really matters to so many different pieces. And it's not just procurement, it's HR, it's financial management. So, but let's talk procurement a little bit and what's that interaction has been to get procurement officials to understand the procurement piece to StateRAMP and really cyber more broadly.
So procurement officials understand risk mitigation, they understand audit, they understand financial responsibility, if you will, for their agency, whether it's private or public sector. And that's exactly what StateRAMP is helping to mitigate, is some of that risk long term. Our states and our public officials struggle with bandwidth and resources. So we do our best with what we have to make good decisions for suppliers to start our contracts. We don't always have the bandwidth and resources to carry on the monitoring and cybersecurity monitoring throughout the life of the contract. That's where we look at third parties to enter to help us. StateRAMP, being a nonprofit, helps us mitigate the continuous monitoring programs that are needed to ensure that our suppliers are maintaining minimum cybersecurity standards. From a procurement perspective, we can put together the best contract possible, but at the end of the day, if we don't have the right stakeholders and partners involved in a conversation, that contract will be unsuccessful.
Well, you said a couple things that I was going to tag back to. Help mitigate risks.
Yeah.
One thing I've heard from some of the IT folks during my conversations today has been, well, we got to get procurement on the front end. We need to make sure that cybersecurity is not, is baked in, not bolted on. We've heard this for 100 years, it feels like. How does StateRAMP, as an example, but more broadly, the work you've been doing with NASCIO, ensure that baked-in part and not the bolt-on part?
Yeah, great conversation. So governance and good governance starts with a conversation. Thereafter, we bring in the appropriate stakeholders throughout the life of the contract. So I want to tag on to something that you just mentioned. Procurement tagged on at the end. Cybersecurity tagged on at the end. There is no end to the life of a good contract and a good vendor-partner relationship. Folks have to have the right structure and framework at the very beginning. Then they have to carry those good internal relationships and conversations as we are selecting a supplier. And then those relationships, while the human bodies may change a little bit in the conversations throughout the contract, but every stakeholder needs to be represented, including the business, including audit, risk, financial management, and the supplier. And that's how we get through with minimal risk right to the very end.
Are you finding that the procurement folks, and again, it's hard to say, 50 states, territories, state and local, so it's hard to blanket, but do you find, as you talk to folks, that getting the procurement folks in that governance part as part of the key stakeholders during the conversations with the CISOs, that's easier today than it has been in the last 3, 5, 7 years?
Oh, absolutely. Post-COVID, I love procurement is in the limelight. right? Think back to COVID. You wanted wipes, you wanted gloves, you wanted all the things. Where were you coming? You weren't going to the CISO, you're going to procurement. And now, fast forward to 2024, procurement is still having a seat at the table, which is fantastic. So our CISOs are able to rely on us to provide good guidance and feedback throughout the procurement process to ultimately select those suppliers that will meet those minimum cybersecurity standards. It's fantastic.
And I think there's also the opposite side of it is there's a new respect for what goes into procurement. So a CISO or a CIO is not just throwing the requirements or the transom, or in that case, the business people. They're actually saying, okay, we got to work closer because there's a timeliness factor, there's a security factor, there's all the supply chain factors that all get built into that. That's the other side, that if you will, the silver lining of the pandemic in many ways too.
Well, let's take that a step farther. Not only do the CIOs, CISOs, and business officials have more respect for procurement and what we do to follow our statutes and laws, but the CPOs are also having a greater understanding for the CISOs and what their protections are, what their ultimate goal is.
And I think that's a nice come back around to StateRAMP a little bit, because the way StateRAMP is set up, and because the way it's bringing the stakeholders together. Are you finding that this is alleviating some of the challenges, obstacles to getting secure services set up in states across the country?
Sure. StateRAMP is another tool in the toolbox. There's FedRAMP, there's other opportunities to look at. Many states still want to do their own cybersecurity standards, and that's another option as well, depending on bandwidth and resources. My role at NASPA Value Point is to put together contracts that make the most sense from a national perspective. We put contracts together following a lead state model. We follow the statutes of any particular state that would put out a particular RFP. And within those RFPs, we ask for those offers to be either FedRAMP compliant or StateRAMP compliant, or maintain the minimum NIST standards. And then thereafter, once we select our suppliers, StateRAMP may be the ultimate choice for the continuous monitoring. But StateRAMP plays it's a critical component of one tool in the toolbox that is an option.
So that's interesting that you say when we put together a contract, you can be FedRAMP, you can be StateRAMP, or you can somehow self-ascertain the fact I follow NIST. But then if I'm a state and I come to use that cooperative agreement, I can say the company must be StateRAMP or FedRAMP, right? That NIST standards I may not want them. I can say that through the task order or...
Sure. We may not, if I'm state X and state Y put out the contract, right? State X may not trust that state Y is going to be able to follow that continuous monitoring. And most critically, what we see so often, states and or any other public entity will get into a contractual relationship with a supplier, and then that supplier actually defaults on their cybersecurity standards. And we as a public official, we don't have enough bodies to continue to maintain. Many states have thousands and thousands of contractors. Okay. They don't always know when there is a breach or when somebody has fallen below the minimum thresholds, and that's where StateRAMP comes into play. We rely heavily on our partners. One state may not trust another state, but really, when you have a third party that maintains that continuous monitoring, it's critical to the success of the relationship.
Are you finding that most industry, they're either already FedRAMP or StateRAMP approved, and that's just, it's common now versus maybe it wasn't so common several years ago?
I would say it's becoming increasingly more common. Folks out there in the cloud industry recognize that there is a minimum level of cybersecurity requirements that are expected from a government perspective. While we do get offers that say, hey, we'll get on board on the train if you give us a contract, those are probably few and farther in between.
And that's true. I know that one of the things that came up with my conversations with the folks from StateRAMP was the cost factor.
Yeah.
The how much it does cost to go through the process. And I hear it all the time on the federal side, the cost to get through the FedRAMP process. So I know for a lot of small and medium businesses, that's a big challenge. And I know that's something that StateRAMP is working on. I want to talk a little bit about the broader idea of procurement and cybersecurity. How have you seen the contracting world change and to again, embrace cybersecurity from terms and conditions, from an expectation, and even just from how does this source selection is maybe a little too deep for you because where you sit at NASPO, but,
sure.
But how the overall process?
I think it's really important as a procurement official, whether I'm involved at the ground level or right at the very top, we have the processes in place to identify in whatever scope of work it may be, whatever makes the most sense. Procurement really does a good job at putting together the right processes from a general perspective, and then we apply it as needed, whether it's cloud solutions, whether it's, what have you, that any other given software. So I'm really pleased that procurement has started to take a deeper understanding of those cybersecurity requirements.
We know it's a good thing, so I want to ask you, is it a good thing? But what do you think precipitated this? Was it the idea that your data has been stolen, my data has been stolen, the threat of ransomware? What do you think really drove this change?
No, definitely not the threat of ransomware. That's my CIO or CISO's responsibility to maintain and understand that. Really what precipitated it from a procurement perspective is the almighty dollar. And what you mentioned earlier around cost being a factor, that is a huge driving factor for procurement. It's not the only factor, but it is a key driving factor. So when we think about how much it costs a state or a public entity to put out an RFP and ultimately select a supplier, not only is it expensive for us, it's expensive for the supplier. And if I'm a supplier responding to 50, 100 RFPs in a year and I have to tailor my process every single time, guess where that cost gets passed back to? Yeah, the public entity. And that's not, we as, the stewards of good taxpayer dollars, we want to make sure that we're mitigating that cost as much as possible. Enter FedRAMP, enter StateRAMP. It's helping to reduce the cost and the administrative burden.
Are you able to pinpoint maybe a percentage is hard, but that, hey, when we use StateRAMP, we're saving time, money? Are you able to kind of quantify that in some way? Or is that, again, it is because it's logical, but maybe it's harder metrics because everything is so different?
So I'm going to fast forward this conversation to 12 to 24 months from now, and I will answer that question with an affirmative percentage. Right now, in 2024, StateRAMP is not mature and old enough to be able to pinpoint some data points. Next year, we will have those percentages because we're starting to see StateRAMP as a minimum requirement option more and more in RFPs. So we're starting to collect the data, but I don't have a percentage today.
I will come back and ask you that question.
Yes, I will see you next year.
Because I think it's really an important discussion to say, hey, we're not just doing this because you got to do it.
Yeah.
Look, it can save you X percentage, and that's really important. You mentioned the potential news later on. Let's talk about what's happening now. What is also NASPO working on? You mentioned, let's maybe start with some of the cooperative portfolios. Talk a little bit about that and the way cyber fits in.
NASPO has a number of portfolios that touches cloud providers and other software providers. So we are looking at our lead states who help us put our portfolios together to implement cybersecurity standards. NASPO offers best guiding principles, best practices. For example, we put out there terms and conditions for our states to utilize. We recommend on any portfolio that a state will allow us that we include StateRAMP as an option. But our role is to really help guide states to ultimately make the best solution and choice for their state and their particular needs.
And a portfolio can include, you mentioned a bunch of things. Is it always contracts or not necessarily? Meaning the end result is a cooperative contract that these 10 states can use, or however many? In
our world, in NASPO Value Point, yes, that's exactly what it means. We will put together a portfolio with a number of providers. It could be as small as one provider. Typically, it's as many as 10 to 16. We do have a portfolio that's up to 63 different providers for our cloud solutions portfolio. It just depends on the need and the scope. We feel really strongly that it's important to have a number of choices in procurement for our members, states, and or other public entities, and then they can make the best choice that makes sense for them.
Generally speaking, explain a little bit how that process works. If I'm a state, do I come to you and say, I want to get a Gen AI contract? So people have to pay because everything's Gen AI these days. Or do you see a need and you start collecting, okay, that state's interested, that state's, let's do something because we have enough people that are interested.
I love that.
Or both.
I love that question, Jason. There is no wrong door into cooperative procurement. Most oftentimes, because we serve the 50 plus members of our country, we get ideas from them. We start to understand what their needs are, and then we will put together portfolios that best serve them. But if you're a local municipal university, if you have an idea, I would encourage anyone to reach out to the NASPO staff, and we will take a look at it to see if it makes sense to put contracts together from a national perspective.
And I'm sure if I go to NASPO's website, I can find all the information of which contracts are out there.
Yes, 63 different portfolios, naspo.org. We have over 600 different contractors available at your fingertips.
All right, we will make sure we link to that on federalnewsnetwork.com as well. Jamie, I appreciate our conversation. The last piece I just want to touch upon, and I think this brings it all together, is this idea of the workforce and contracting officers. I see it in the federal world. There's never enough. They're overworked. We're in the federal fourth quarter, and you see the overwhelming amount of money that has to go out the door. Hopefully states are better about their budgeting in terms of when they get their budgets versus the feds. Either way, how does something like StateRAMP and the cooperative purchasing, the agreements that you guys put together, how does that help the workforce get more done? Because more people is just not necessarily happening very often.
Yeah, absolutely consistent with state level, local level, university level, you name it. There is not enough people to go around for the jobs in the way that we have always performed the jobs. There's empty seats, vacancies, there's not enough money, we can't buy enough. So StateRAMP really is a critical component in helping us when we have suppliers that we are contracted with. StateRAMP will help ensure that we maintain a minimum level of cybersecurity standards to ensure the maximum safety of our data as public officials and for all of our constituents.
Are you finding that driving people to become contracting officers and work in the world of acquisition is still as difficult as it's always been? I hear that in the federal world, we have to explain to them what they're doing. They don't just buy stuff.
Sure.
They're to bigger impact.
There's a difference in a purchasing agent that existed 30, 40, 50 years ago and procurement officials that exist in today's world. Procurement is a career of choice now. It's not a career of default. We are recognized at a number of levels, including the federal level, as a purchasing agent, but we do so much more than purchase something. As the former CPO of the state of Maine and as the Chief Cooperative Procurement Officer for NASPO, I have actually never bought anything in my life. I put together contracts for everyone else who gets to spend their money. So what I would say is that procurement really is an incredible career of choice that combines so many skill sets to ultimately make a successful CPO.
There's NASPO's ad for next year right there.
Absolutely.
Jamie, I very much appreciate our time today, but we are out of time, so let me thank my guest. Jamie Schorr is the Chief Cooperative Procurement Officer at the National Association of State Procurement Officials. Jamie, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason. Great to see you today.